Today we're covering off the differences between and the impacts of using the contractual overdue values and the current overdue values. So first off, we'll discuss the basics. Most of us will know what overdue means, but just in case, and for the purposes of completeness, and to cover it off for those who don't necessarily have a collections or recoveries-based finance background, I have included a simplified explanation of what overdue means. So there's several terms used throughout the finance industry for loans operating outside of their agreed terms, which are also pictured down the bottom. Clients may use terms such as late payments, in arrears, and default, and delinquent loans, for example. So when is a loan considered overdue? As I've already hinted at, typically the loan is overdue when the repayments have not been made on time according to the loan agreement. It remains overdue until the loan is considered to be back on track or up to date. For example, in its simplest form, a missed or late payment. So if a borrower had missed one payment of $75 that was scheduled, they would be overdue by $75 plus any default interest or fees if applicable, and would be considered overdue once any payment grace periods that had been applied were exhausted. Whether or not a loan is actually considered overdue in terms of FinPower Connect lender definitions, as mentioned, first and foremost is based on their definitions and what's outlined in the terms of their credit contracts. Second, for any action to be taken, FinPower Connect requires configuration accordingly so that it can correctly identify the loans falling into these overdue definitions and from there take the set actions and notifications that have been configured. Before we move on specifically to contractual and current overdue, I also wanted to briefly cover another term that is often heard throughout the finance industry that has multiple meanings depending on the context and the lender's business model, and that term is in default. So as you can see here, the basic definition for a default in the context of finance is the failure to fulfill a contract, agreement or duty, the same as we've covered for overdue. However, generally speaking, it's widely accepted that saying a loan is in default, that the situation is at a further stage in the collections process or it's violated different terms of the agreement, such as not meeting conditions set at the loan's origination, like repaying other loans with the proceeds. Where a borrower is in breach of contract for terms other than missed payments, this is often known as a non-financial default. As you can see in our image here, there are ways non-financial accounts can be flagged as in default within FinPower Connect to enable the lender to charge default interest, etc., when these scenarios have occurred if desired. So there's a little flag on a monitor category called in default, and that will then refer back to the account type settings and then charge it on the balance. We'll cover the settings in more detail soon. Being in default can also mean that the account has likely reached the stage of loading a credit bureau default, or is even at the bad debt write-off stage. When a default is registered with a credit bureau, it impacts a client's credit history and stays in place for 5 years. It's also important to note that a client will show as being in default or behind on their credit report under the comprehensive credit reporting section where there is the last 24 months payment history shown. So essentially the message here is that if a lender is referring to defaults, we need to clarify specifically what defaults they are referring to so that the settings can be configured correctly and any customizations cover all aspects that may be required. So then, what is contractual overdue and why is it sometimes different to what we refer to as the current overdue? So FinPower Connect offers 2 different ways of measuring whether or not an account is overdue, and based on that, what action to take. As you can probably imagine, when thinking about taking action on overdue loans, this can look very different from one lender to another, depending on their specific requirements, processes, and overall business model. Thus, there are numerous ways within FinPower Connect to set different things and to be aware of during both the initial configuration and when changing the basis on which the overdue is measured throughout the system, ensuring all impacted areas are operating based on the correct values. This image here shows briefly the areas containing the majority of these related settings, where either the contractual or current overdue values can be used. So the account type settings in area and global settings, which we'll cover soon, some event script constants, and reporting. The contractual overdue is the amount the loan is behind according to the original schedule, or on a fixed term loan, if the account has been restructured, the restructured schedule then replaces the contractual terms. For example, if a payment arrangement has been made on a fixed term loan, this only alters the current schedule. Therefore, an account may still be in arrears based on the original or restructured schedule if the payments are not made in line with those contracted terms. This will then show as being contractually overdue if used, even if the current overdue shows as zero, so something to be aware of. The current overdue is payments received measured against payments due according to the current schedule. And the schedule is, as mentioned, impacted by things like payment arrangements. Therefore, depending again on the lender's configuration and what has happened to the loan throughout its life, can mean that the current overdue balance differs from the contractual, as mentioned. There are many reasons a lender may choose to use the contractual overdue, even if only for reporting purposes. It may also be that they've agreed to a temporary change to the payments under a payment arrangement. For example, if they're overdue to catch up, or a temporary hardship agreement, but do not want to alter the original contracted terms or complete a restructure. The user does, of course, have the option of suspending the default interest for that period if required. Whatever reasoning, FinPower Connect handles both. Another example is that a lender may have their default interest set to be calculated and charged based on the contractual overdue rather than the current, and the value of the default interest charged will be different than what it could have been if it was being calculated on the current overdue. Makes sense, right? But at this point, you can probably imagine there can be significant financial impacts to both the lender and the borrower, particularly if there's a large difference between the two overdue balances. We have covered in a previous session on restructures that one of the account classes are more likely to see large differences on this is fixed term loans, because as mentioned, the only way the contractual values get updated, such as the loan term repayment values and the interest rate, is if a restructure is completed. Going back to our example, if they'd agreed to a payment arrangement at a lower value than the original contract, which effectively extends the term, this only impacts the current schedule. Therefore, the contractual overdue has the capacity to keep climbing, and so too with their default interest charges. So again, just something to keep in mind when configuring this area. Fixed-term floating rate loans, however, will have the contractual values updated after a payment review or floating interest rate change because of the original design and purpose of the account type. Another note on the account classes themselves would be that revolving credit loans, contractual overdue isn't really widely used due to the nature of those accounts and the purpose of the account class. The current overdue makes a lot more sense. So you might ask, how does FinPower Connect determine which one is being used? Excellent question, and why we're really here today. So first we'll take a quick look at the account, just to have a look at where these values appear. So obviously on the key details page, we can see the two values here of overdue and contractual. So in this case, both of these are the same, so the schedule is currently in sync. Financial page, we can have a look at the schedules. So on this loan here, obviously we have the opening schedule, which is the original contractual schedule, a restructured schedule, and then the current. So when the account opens, the current schedule's created and gets updated by payment arrangements and such. So anyway, moving along. On our status page, we also have summary blocks here, which go into a little bit more detail on the overdues themselves. So you can see here, there is a slight difference between the overdue and the contractual block. You'll see massive differences if our earlier scenario is encountered. Whether or not this displays, because obviously it can be confusing to the user if they only use one and not the other, is an account type setting, which I'll show you shortly. On the account type settings themselves, obviously we have our overdue and defaults page, which we've covered before, but here are some of the settings for the reporting side of things. And down here is where you choose which basis you're going to charge default interest on, overdue or contractual, and whether or not you're charging it on the overdue balance or the balance. Again, this is where you can configure the account type to charge default interest for non-financial defaults, but this also matches up with the monitor category. So if we go to admin monitor categories, we can see there's this option here, should the account be treated as if in default. If this is ticked on, it relates back to this setting here, and default interest will be charged on the balance of the loan while it's in that monitor category. So that makes it really handy to flicker in and out of default. If they haven't met a condition, then they meet the condition, take it out of the monitor category, and everything is back to being hunky-dory. Again, there's also the option to charge default interest on the entire balance rather than just the overdue post-maturity, and that then looks at our basis again as to whether it's overdue or contractual overdue. On the other page, this is, as mentioned before, where you can choose whether you're showing the overdue values or the contractual overdues on the summaries throughout. So it's important to note though, if it's past maturity, it will always show a contractual overdue value, regardless of whether this is ticked or not. In addition to that, there is the overdue rules, which we have covered before, but just briefly. This is another area where you can set the overdue test for the rule based on either the contractual or the current overdue, as shown here. So if you drill down into the rule, you can see you can set specific conditions on either overdue or any contractual overdue conditions. And from there, the rule will obviously do the balance of whatever you've configured it to do, so send an overdue letter, etc. There is also settings in global settings, and this is specifically for credit bureau default. So you can choose to base that on the contractual overdue rather than the current, which means obviously that can mean the defaulted amount can vary quite a lot, depending again on our original scenario and whether or not they're using contractual or current and have payment arrangements. And finally, the other settings I wanted to briefly cover, but not in depth, are the script constants. So there's a couple of common scripts that have related settings, mostly in relation to comprehensive credit reporting. The account history rating script which is what goes through and sets the values for the comprehensive credit reporting. The option to use contractual overdue days instead of overdue days for the basis of this as well, so something to be aware of. There is a lot more we could cover, including how re-aging and things works, but I think that's probably where I'll leave it for today. But if anybody has any further questions, please feel free to contact application support for user interface queries or code support for any code-specific queries for customizations in this area.